Natalie, you can start with your introduction. We are live.
Okay. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for inviting Song of the Cricket and the University of Melbourne to the International Federation of Landscape Architecture Asia Pacific Region Talk and Share series. We're thrilled to be here across time zones, waterways and landscapes, predominantly from Naarm in Melbourne. But before we commence, I would like to invite Professor Michael Sean Fletcher to give an acknowledgement to country.
Thanks, Natalie. It's customary in Australian Aboriginal cultures to acknowledge country. So I'd like to take a moment to do so before we get on with the work that we're going to be talking about today. As we come from all corners of the globe, we recognise that each of us is joining us from a place with its own rich history, deep connection of Indigenous peoples to country, or to lands, as you may call it where you are. So I'd like to pay respects to the traditional owners, traditional custodians, the Indigenous peoples from wherever you are, and honour their elders past and present. As landscape architects and enthusiasts, I think you're all really acutely aware of the profound relationship between people and place. We acknowledge Indigenous peoples who have been the stewards of the landscapes across the world for tens of thousands of years. Their wisdom, sustainable practices and deep understanding of the land have shaped the environments that we work with, work in and study today. We recognise that Indigenous knowledge systems offer invaluable insights into creating harmonious and sustainable landscapes. So thanks for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to unpacking what we've got to talk about today.
Thank you, Michael, for grounding us in place, landscape, country, and reminding us of our interconnectedness. We're really thrilled to be presenting today our project at the Architettura Biennale curated by Carlo Ratti, called Song of the Cricket. It's this 19th International Architecture Biennale. And Song of the Cricket, some of you may have been able to visit, is a living habitat and ecosystem. It's an intertidal confluence of land and sea. Song of the Cricket provides a cycle of the endangered Venetian cricket, and we'll hear more about the cricket shortly, and a signal of the rhythm and flow of the wetland organism. The crickets sing, mate, rest, restore, and repopulate, revealing how a microecology of non-humans can be a bioindicator. Song of the Cricket is also about fragility, a song of survival, encouraging us to listen to nature and amplify its clarion call. We hope that today's session will provide terrain for future collaborations, friendships, and gatherings. Our first speaker has led and instigated this project. His name is Alex Felsen, and he is the Elizabeth Murdoch Chair of Landscape Architecture at the University of Melbourne's Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. He is a senior certified ecologist and a registered landscape architect. He works as an academic and practicing professional to advance resilient, livable cities and sustainable planning, landscape architecture, and urban design. He focuses on climate adaptation, green infrastructure, and constructed ecosystems across multiple scales. He holds a PhD in ecology and evolution from Rutgers University and an MLA from Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, and an MS in land resources from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Alex will share with us his ideas on landscape architecture and designed ecological experiments with the focus on Song of the Cricket. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Natalie. And I will now share my screen. Actually, I'll do the second one here. Great. And I just want to say thanks to everyone who's joined today. This is a collaborative project that's been quite exciting to coordinate with everyone closely and to bring the role of landscape architecture and the position of landscape architecture into a variety of disciplines and into spaces that I think we as landscape architects should be encouraged to influence and be part of. And so today's presentation is in many ways about that collaboration. I'm going to start just with a context around the framing of this project, around designed experiments and methodologies that I've developed over time to integrate ecological experiments with urban design. And so I'm just going to jump in and give an overview before we then start to hear from the individual team members and their facets of the project. This is the original, and as you can see, the Venice Biennale, we were selected as a special project to illustrate the living lab intentions of Carlo Ratti's vision for the Venice Biennale. So that context, I would say, for the landscape architect, and I run the urban ecology and design lab within the architecture, building and planning, is an example of kind of industry partnerships, collaborative partnerships within the university that all led to this kind of space. And I think for landscape architecture, it's important to recognize that our discipline is one with a lot of a broad knowledge and a variety of expertise across technical skills, across cultural skills. And so as a landscape architecture practitioner, I think it's challenging and valuable to kind of explore that information and think about how we synthesize that information effectively. Recognizing that the process of gathering information is always going to be somewhat incomplete, and there's a role for science and ecological knowledge and cultural knowledge alongside creative thinking, recognizing that there's knowledge gaps and there's pillars of knowledge, and we're making choices with incomplete information, and we don't always have the best available science. I think it gives room for the creative mind to synthesize and effectively invent in a way across different scales, across different temporal conditions, across different social conditions, to start to address some of the critical challenges that society faces around ecological, social, economic, climate risks, around biodiversity and management, around land stewardship. And landscape architects work across scales, and I think that ability to cross scales and design across those scales effectively and between them is one of our greatest strengths. So we can work on projects where we're doing microclimate conditions at a very local scale, and we'll talk a bit about this. And then thinking about how that manifests into site design strategies, or we can work at the scale of a country and start to analyze critical flow patterns and systems across that scale, and to incorporate and synthesize that into design approaches. So, this idea of linking and working collaboratively, working across scales, thinking about different agency officials, academics, industry, and partnerships, this is, in my mind, the expertise and the skill set of the landscape architect. And we use the design process as a means to facilitate those exchanges effectively and to foster and grow kind of emergent types of projects. These kinds of projects are increasingly critical, I think, for humanity around climate resilience and adaptation. And so I think in a way, the Venice project provided an opportunity for this kind of synthesis through a methodology that I call designed experiments, which are essentially projects embedded in ecological research and urban design. And if you see the design process here, typically the environmental consultant does site analysis and the designer builds on that, or maybe the urban ecologist studies the built city after it's been designed. The idea behind the designed experiment is it uses the design process as an iterative space for ecologists and designers to collaborate on the project and develop something inventive. It also positions the landscape architect in that area where the research ecologist is studying the earth to understand how the system works. And typically that experimental design is kind of a black box and we get the results from it. But in this case, the designed experiment brings the landscape architect into a direct relationship with the ecologist in that space. This is what I used when I was working for AECOM with the city of New York City to set up the reforestation plan for New York City, which was part of the Million Trees. So we set it up as a long-term ecological research project, asking some fundamental questions like, are constructed urban forests self-sustaining, and are constructed native forests resilient in the face of urban stressors? Were we planting an urban, a perennial garden or a successional forest? They're fundamental questions that don't have a lot of data and information to support it. And the landscape architect has a role to play in allowing or facilitating the ecologists to work together to, on a site, to develop this kind of research-based methodology and embed these research experiments. At the same time, the landscape architect is involved in design and construction. And so there's an opportunity to work with the Parks Department, for example, to test some of their assumptions about how to manage effectively an urban forest and how to build an urban forest given the soil challenges, et cetera. And then how does that experimental design start to come together as a design aesthetic that can start to communicate the performance of that ecological system, but also can be digestible and function for the public. And so then translating that or bringing that information into a lab space where you're actually testing and evaluating the outcomes of the design and looking at the health of those ecosystems, and then feeding that back into kind of adaptive management strategy to inform some of the fundamental questions that we're asking. In this way, the design experiment is a two-way street. It's not just us taking ecological information from the ecologist and then applying it to design. We're actually working back and forth in an iterative, creative process through the design process and providing feedbacks and learning opportunities. And it's been interesting collaborating with ecologists over time, because what I've found is that the relationships change and the priorities change. And I'm going to come back to this important diagram, which starts to suggest that the landscape architect is not always the primary person. Sometimes the ecologist steps in and plays more of a role, or the cultural geographer, or the composer in this case. So, there's a role for each of the individuals to foster the project and move it forward. I brought a lot of this together in the US through the Earth Stewardship Initiative, which I ran from 2014 to 2017 in different cities. And we were looking at a variety of factors relevant to urban ecology and urban systems. And then we used the design process to develop a kind of ecological and art-based collaborative model for developing designed experiments for cities. That methodology started to define these issues, that we need to really clarify what needs to be studied. We need to improve communication across parties, identify more pragmatic actions for scientists, and expand on how scientific research can inform shaping strategies. And also influence this idea of kind of how to adaptively co-manage, thinking about innovative institutional arrangements and incentives across temporal scales, thinking about complexity, monitoring and assessment strategies, the role of power and influence, and the opportunity to link science and policy. And that really led to this kind of understanding that there are a variety of distinct differences between the design professions and the science professions that need to be navigated over time. So in coming to Melbourne in 2020, I developed a working relationship with Ari Hoffman, who's also will be presenting, and Michael Kearney and others on looking at matchstick grasshoppers, which is a particular species that they were working on translocation. And we were looking at Royal Park, this really interesting large park that exists within the city of Melbourne, where a variety of experimental research is already ongoing. So these design experiments, as I call them, were already in play. We were interested in this idea of how to utilize an organism like the matchstick grasshopper as a catalyst for urban food webs. How can you reintroduce a species like this and catalyze ecological function? We were looking also at the relationship of that organism to the seasonal calendar from the Wurundjeri, starting to recognize, as Michael Sean Fletcher was mentioning, the importance of country and rethinking our own Western understanding of species and their interaction over time. And so we were looking at the ways in which this reintroduction could influence a variety of species and how it could fit into this long history of experimentation across the park. Part of this was navigating through the kind of design aesthetic and how to coordinate the experimental design with the kind of identity and existing nature of the park, and how to take some of the cues from the park to inform the experimental strategies that we were proposing. And so we wanted to make sure that the experimental design was embedded in some ways into the aesthetic and functionality of the park. And we were looking for ways of building in this experimental design while not making it too obvious or sort of formal. And so kind of summarizing that, we developed a series of paired research experiments where we looked at more coarse-grained versus fine-grained plots and we are developing those plots over time, laying them out in the across the park in pairs, and essentially developing those plots for species translocations to look at how the match the grasshopper does in a coarse grain condition versus a fine grain condition where you have more or less edge. So just to summarize that that experimental design, and in a way, this is to set the stage for some of the other presentations and also for how we applied the designed experiments model to Venice. Thinking about fundamentally building relationships, serving as a tool for research and analysis, relying on the design process as a critical factor and producing this new knowledge, are all kind of key components of the designed experiments framework. And I'll wrap up there just to say that the goals with the Venice project are to follow this designed experiments approach and really to explore the way in which this collaborative model can influence entomologists, fine arts, computer science, digital technology, and geospatial planning, and how we as landscape architects can foster this kind of collaborative space where we're shaping and influencing ecological function and developing design aesthetic, urbanism, and kind of longer term ecological roles for biodiversity in urban environments. Now we'll wrap up there. Thank you very much. Natalie, you're just on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Alex. Our next speaker in our lightning talks is Ari Hoffman, who will be speaking about translocation and the matchstick grasshopper as a bioindicator. Ari, if you could kindly introduce yourself, and we look forward to your presentation.
Sure. My name is Ari Hoffman. I'm an ecologist and geneticist, and I do a lot of work on insects. And I have a keen interest in climate change, a bit like Alex, but also very much conservation and what you can do, particularly on the climate change and urbanizations. It's kind of interesting that I've really enjoyed this project that we've started, and I think it's been quite enlightening for me because, of course, we tend to work on species and we tend to study them from the ecology side, but of course we now realize, particularly on the massive changes that are occurring in urban areas and outside urban areas, that we have to do something else. So it's really time to take a few risks, and I think this is where landscape ecologists can really come in and help us. And this is, I think, the conversation that we have to have. So I might just start my slides. I think you've got those, Alex, haven't you? So.
I do, yes. There we go.
Excellent. Thank you. So as Alex said, Michael Carney is the other person that's involved in this, and we've also got Jess Sinclair from the zoo and Aroma Yagu, who's done a lot of this work. She's a PhD student that's just finishing up. So there's the majestic matchstick grasshopper, and as you can see, it likes to eat flowers. It's sitting on top of a daisy. It's a native Australian daisy, and it's quite a small species. Next slide. Then you can see that it's quite small, but it's certainly visible. Kids love it because they can pick it up. It's flightless, and it's quite unique. It's actually restricted to Australia. This entire family of grasshoppers is restricted to Australia, and grasshoppers, of course, related to crickets, closely related to crickets biologically. So this is a winter active species, and Alex mentioned the fact that these things are incredibly important from a food web point of view. And of course, there's not much food around in winter, even in Melbourne. And these sorts of grasshoppers can provide a wonderful source of food. So they're very important as a base level, if you like, in terms of a food chain. And that's an important way to think about. But they are very unique. They're quite lovely, and they have about a generation per year. And what I'm going to do now is just talk a bit more about these grasshoppers and what we've done with them, particularly in terms of translocations. Next slide. So this is the rough distribution of the species, and those red dots indicate where there's been a record of them. So they occur in Tasmania. I'm not sure if you're that familiar with Australia, some of you at least. And they occur, of course, in South Australia and in Victoria. Now, that big blob down south is Melbourne. You can probably just make that out. And of course, that's a major urban area. But this is an area in a part of Australia that's been absolutely decimated in terms of landscape changes. There's lots of agriculture here, there's lots of urban development. And of course, what's happened is you got a species that was incredibly widespread has now become very restricted to a few sites. So in a sense, it's on the way out. It doesn't handle agricultural intensification very well, and it doesn't handle urbanization very well at all. The next slide. So here's part of the problem, right? So of course, these wonderful eucalyptus woodlands on the outskirts of Melbourne are being cleared and being cleared for housing mostly. And of course, there's a massive loss of biodiversity when that happens. So this was actually a spot that we encountered by chance, and it was during COVID. So we're in the middle of lockdown, and Michael and I were looking around, and we suddenly realized that this grasshopper we'd been looking at was actually present at this particular site. So we thought, wow, this is exciting. We better try and save it. And so we got a special permit to collect the grasshoppers and attempt to translocate them as a model system in terms of trying to see if you can actually translocate into urban areas. So what we want to do, of course, is to take advantage of revegetation areas that are happening around Melbourne and elsewhere, and saying, well, can they be actually useful in terms of conserving these sorts of species that are clearly being going to a stage of being quite threatened. So that's the scenario we started off with. So we ended up, so before the housing went up, we ended up collecting a lot of grasshoppers. If you go to the next slide, and we started translocating them into different places. So we actually worked on 36 sites around Melbourne, and each one of those black dots is a site that we translocated into. And of course, these grasshoppers, having one generation per year, can be monitored across generations. And I'm not just talking about releasing them and seeing what happens to them, we can actually track them across time. So each one of those S's is a monitoring point. The star, the magic star, you can see there is the starting point in 2021, COVID time. And of course, we've gone through 3 generations now to the 4th generation of these grasshoppers. Next slide. So one of the things about these grasshoppers is they're actually quite, they need daisies and they need a bit of open space, but they're a little bit flexible. They're not super fussy about the plants they eat. And, that's typically the case for grasshoppers. Yes, you need native vegetation. Yes, if you get a big weed invasion, you can lose them. And as long as you've got some open area and you've got a bit of plant material to eat, then they can actually do quite well. So these are the sorts of areas that we translocated into. And the one on the left is quite small. And then, of course, the one on the right is quite large. So we had a range of sizes, and we translocated in total almost 2,000 individuals, which we caught by hand and transferred across. And we were putting about 50 grasshoppers for each site. Go to the next one. Next slide, please. Thank you. So some of these sites, as I said, were quite small. And, if you looked at Alex's figures, you'd also see that some of those sites that he's been playing with in Royal Park are quite small. And what we can see is we can see these grasshoppers moving, of course, also in space. So F0 is where we release them. By the time you get to the F1, sometimes they haven't moved very much, as indicated by that circle close to the F0. But sometimes they can move from one side of our little patch to the other side of the patch, as you can see by the F1 symbol. So they do disperse, but they do stick around in this small area. That's actually a bike path you can see next to it. And we certainly didn't have any of these grasshoppers being squashed by bikes, which is a good thing. So next slide. So one of the other things that you can do, of course, as part of this exercise is it's a wonderful opportunity to engage the public. And we did that on several occasions. So the public, they see these entomologists and ecologists walking around with these little handbags full of grasshoppers, and they're curious. So we had some informal chats, and that, of course, became quite popular. And we had the more formal ones, such as this one here. And that's Michael Carney explaining all about these grasshoppers that he's got holding in that particular package that he's holding there. So that's an example of a release site, and these release sites were very community engaging. We also had the mayor of Melbourne at one of them. We had the mayor of another constitution as another one around the Bayside. So the newspapers and what have you love them, and of course the local community really gets on board, right? Because they love to see these sorts of grasshoppers popping up. Next slide. So what did we discover? Well, these are unmanaged translocations, right? Not like the ones that Alex is talking about in Royal Park. So we just put them out there at suitable sites that we knew were going to be suitable, because we wanted to see, what's the probability of getting them established in a situation where you're totally unplanned. And of course, this is something that we have to do better, and this is where landscape architecture comes into it. So what happened? Well, we actually still had half of them carrying grasshoppers after 3 years. That's actually pretty good. The failures were mostly due to modification of the habitat. So on the left-hand side, you've got this nice little patch of grasses and some daisies in the middle. And then, of course, someone comes along and puts a giant heap of basically of bark there, and of course then they start spreading it out because they don't know about the grasshoppers. They want to control the weeds, and they just throw it out everywhere. That smothers everything, right? Insects hate that sort of stuff a lot of the time. A small layer is okay, but as soon as you get too much of it, it smothers it. So, and then of course the daisies also disappear. So by the time we get to 2024, then basically this is a site where no grasshoppers were found. So small site, had the hoppers, released them, quite successful, but then of course after 3 years they've disappeared. So unmanaged, this is where we need the planning. Next slide. And this is, I tend to think of genetics as well. And one of the things we need to also learn about is, if you want to sustain these things for many, many years, you need to get the genetics right. And one of the indicators, the key indicators that we use in ecological genetics is genomic variability. We can actually measure the DNA of these grasshoppers very, very simply these days. And the gray bar is where we started, and the red bars are all the translocations, and that's where we actually ended up. So they've all gone down a bit, and that just means that you need to have some ongoing management to keep them up. Not a problem, but you just need to be aware of this, and this is one of the things you need to do when you do long-term monitoring. It's not just about population size, it's also about the genetics being right. Okay, next slide. So we can now move on to other things, right? So here's a threatened, very closely related species called the Acroscara. The other one was called Venice Biennale. The Attica, this is Acroscara, and this is one that's even more endangered than the other one, right? Than the Laraputa grasshopper. It's only present in a few spots. And this is what we're now doing translocations on. What we learnt, of course, for the initial ones in the urban context can now be applied much more generally. So next slide. And just to finish, I'm just going to show you an example of a remnant patch that's incredibly important from an insect point of view. So that threatened species, this is a lesser threatened species, occurs in that little gray area. You can see in the middle of this massive area of weeds. That's all in brown and yellows. And this has been there for 200 years, right? So it's an incredibly valuable spot where a threatened species that's sitting in the middle of basically the edge of a road that's been there for 200 years. That's because the native daisies have actually persisted there. So we've got the small patches of biodiversity. And that's one of the things about insect conservation, also one of the things that's attractive for people like Alex, because you can do a lot with these very small areas if you can actually maintain them. So I think that's my last slide. Just double check. I think that's it. So here we are, grasshoppers, matchstick grasshoppers, and there she is. And that's actually one of the translocations we've done of endangered species. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari, for a really fascinating presentation about the flightless grasshopper and the notions of insect conservation. Our next speaker in our lightning talks is Ross Dennis, and they will speak about geospatial planning and analysis for ecological values, cricket as an ecological sentinel for ecosystem health. Please introduce yourself, Ross, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Hi, everybody there. I'm Ross Dennis, and I lead the ecology team at Arup in the Melbourne office. I was engaged with Alex on this project at the outset, and had the pleasure of being able to work across and bring some of our expertise to the project across a range of disciplines and domains. So the sound of crickets is synonymous with an awkward pause, but it might be awkwarder still without the crickets. The sound of crickets could be the sound of a flourishing ecosystem and an excellent bioindicator. My role was to bring together Arup disciplines of geospatial data science, ecology, acoustics, and lighting to support the realization of the song of the cricket. We're a bit spoiled at Arup. We're able to draw on a vast range of disciplines and expertise, many of whom are enthusiastic to do something interesting when it's put before them. And this captivating project, which throughout its development kept building in richness and meaning and impact and possibilities, was no exception. Specifically, I helped focused the collaboration of our digital and geospatial team in collaboration with the Sistilla team to develop modelling of suitable habitat for the cricket in both the present day and for future scenarios. The purpose of which was to, I guess, initiate this open-ended discussion around the conservation of the cricket, the conservation of the wetland and lagoon complex of Venice more broadly, and where we can maybe hope to target rehabilitation efforts and habitat creation and reintroductions of the cricket in the future. So I'll briefly set the scene as to, why the cricket was important, and the sound of the cricket in particular, and why we undertook this modelling of habitat. So why focus on the cricket and its song? Well, building on the design experiment approach, which Alex spoke of, and then Ari gave an excellent example of the grasshopper, the matchstick grasshopper in Melbourne's Royal Park. We're hoping to translate that approach into a new geography and indeed a new species, although not one too far removed from the cricket. So we could really draw on some of those lessons learned. This cricket that's native to the Venice Lagoon is endangered, as Natalie said at the start. It once used to thrive in the Venice Lagoon wetlands, but until recently was thought to be locally extinct. And its recent rediscovery has sparked a reintroduction program to help its survival. As Ari said, insects are an important component of the food web and the food chain, sitting at the base and providing an important foundation for animals poised a little bit further up the food chain. These animals are probably ones that we're more commonly used to thinking of when we think of biodiversity, birds and reptiles and mammals, etc. So it's a very important foundation for the food web. The cricket also requires a minimum sort of threshold of ecosystem condition. So we can think therefore of this cricket, similarly to the grasshopper, as an indicator of the condition of the ecosystem. And it is an important ecosystem. The Venice Lagoon is listed as one of the protected areas which make up the EU Protected Areas Network, also known as Natura 2000. This initiative aims to protect the most valuable and threatened species and habitat in the EU member states. Specifically, the lagoon is listed for its important habitat as a coastal lagoon for water birds and threatened species of fish. So this cricket, or insects more broadly, we might be able to think of as a bit of an unsung hero, so to speak. Often out of sight and out of mind. And so often we can forget the insect as we do not frequently see it. But they play an important role in the food chain, as we've discussed, and the ecosystems more broadly. And so it is quite fortuitous and apt that in the case of the cricket, it provides a great reminder of its presence through its wonderful song and chorus, which became the inspiration for much feature of the exhibition. So we don't need to see the cricket to know that it's there. And that chorus gives us a great advantage to use this species as an indicator to focus for restoration efforts. I spoke about the cricket needing, I guess, a level of ecosystem health and being a good indicator of ecosystem health. Now, the ecosystem that and community that the cricket relies on is a wetland fringe, specifically the wetlands around the lagoon, which are dominated by the common reed, Phragmites australis. And to model the future habitat of the cricket, we aimed to model the extent of the Phragmites. And this grows about a half metre, within about a half metre elevation of water bodies, as you can see on the slide there, which in the lower portion illustrates a cross section of the lagoon transitioning into terrestrial ecology, with the Phragmites stands sort of sitting in the middle in that intertidal zone. So wetlands often sit in this ephemeral transition. They sit on the margins of water bodies and can flux seasonally with changes in rainfall, or migrate over a longer period, tracing long-term trends in the landscape. The movement of this fringe of where the aquatic environment meets the terrestrial acts to highlight the movement of water levels. So we can think of the chorus of the song of the cricket as an indicator or a bioindicator of the base of the food web, of a threatened species, of ecosystem health, and an ecosystem that is navigating a path of migration through a dynamic and transient landscape. And so we look to model the cricket's habitat. And as I alluded to, the Phragmites sits in this zone of about a half metre from the level of a water body, in this case the Venice Lagoon. And the water levels in the Venice Lagoon are very closely linked to sea levels. And sea levels are projected to rise over the coming century due to climate change. Hence, with all other factors being equal, which I'll come back to, over the coming century, we would expect to see the movement of the wetland fringe and intertidal zone migrate inland, spurred by rising sea levels. And the migration of this wetland fringe would then come in and confront our built fixed environment, including roads and buildings and farmland. So the act of modelling both the current extent of the Phragmites and hence cricket habitat is important for us to consider where we're going to plan location for rehabilitation sites and translocation, because it allows us then to see where the habitat might be destroyed or run into barriers. What might be a good location with a clear path to migrate across the landscape in the future versus where there might be conflict with other land use. And that will inform a more strategic approach to targeting translocation and rehabilitation. And further to that, we would then be able to use approaches like using audio recorders to monitor the cricket acoustics, and that would inform us of the success of the project as a metric of success through the chorus and call of the cricket. Now I mentioned, actually slide please, Alex. And so this slide just briefly shows some of that initial modelling of the current day extent of the Venice Lagoon, and in the, I guess, yellowy orange, and the areas of urban development and cities in the more deeper red ochre. And if we take the next slide, I mentioned earlier, with all other factors being equal, we would expect a movement in sea level. However, not all factors are going to stay the same. The fate of the city of Venice depends on the lagoon sea level and sea levels as well. And in response to this, the MOSE, which roughly translates to the experimental electromechanical module, was built in response to the sea level rise projections, and was recently installed on the inlets to the Venice Lagoon to protect Venice from tides and storm surges of up to 3 meters, and activating from tides anywhere over 1.3 meters. So we can start to see that there's going to be this trade-off between looking after Venice and protecting Venice from elevating water levels versus trying to maintain the natural rhythms of the lagoons to ensure ecosystem health. So to quote the operator of the Mose system when faced with deciding when to operate the Mose, do I save the city or do I save the lagoon? Although he said it in Italian, I'm not going to take a crack at trying to say that, I'm sorry. Given the Mose has already been utilized 49 times in its first year of operation, despite experts estimating it would only be used 5 times, the question of saving Venice or the lagoon will be faced far sooner than we had expected. So the question then becomes, how can we both protect Venice while supporting rich biological diversity of the lagoon? And I'll leave you to ponder that while I hand it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Ross, for a really fascinating discussion about the cricket as an unsung hero and ideas of spatial modelling, chorus and call. Our next speaker is Professor Michael Sean Fletcher, who is a Wiradjuri man and a geographer. His research focuses on understanding the physical and social drivers of past landscape change across the Southern Hemisphere, using the information stored in wetland sediments and tree rings. Michael's drive is to develop a deeper understanding of how the world around us operates. He is particularly focused on how our long-term relationship with country influences who we are, as well as influencing the environment in which we live. Michael is a Deputy Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Indigenous and Environmental Histories and Futures, and the Associate Dean Indigenous in the Faculty of Science at the University of Melbourne. Michael's presentation is called Cultural Geography, Insects and Indigenous Knowledge. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Natalie. I think my title's a bit different than the one you said, but same thing. Thanks for that, and thanks for everybody coming along. My particular role in this really fascinating and important project is thinking about the why, I guess, in my own head, is why are we doing this? Or more broadly, why are things like this cricket and other species becoming extinct so fast that our current era is being termed a new extinction event, global extinction event? What are the drivers there? Now, the drivers are human activity, and the cynical person in me would think that that's just because we don't care. We actually just don't care about the world around us. We care about ourselves. The less cynical in me would say that in this very globalized world now, where we have people arriving into new places, we don't have the long-term connection to place that has evolved over time with people in the places that they've lived in for millennia. And that makes us ignorant to the connections and the importance of the various things. And I think it's really interesting that whilst the world potentially is focused on things like elephants and pandas and these enigmatic species, that we're focusing on the very opposite end of the scale, the cricket, which, as Ross just pointed out, whilst being a small individual, and actually Ari pointed out that gorgeous tiny little cricket, they have an oversized role in the symphony that we'll exist in day to day. So they have a very big role in our environment. So I thought I'd take us there through an effort of just understanding how we are associated with crickets through time as a lens into the reasons or the fundamental understanding that we've had and that exists in societies today between the world around us and every single component, even putatively the most unimportant tiny little insect that makes a little bit of a sound. So I'll do this through my own peoples. I'm from one of the more than 250 language groups that exist in Australia of Aboriginal peoples. We have these understandings of the world around us and the rhythms in the world around us that we have trying to encode in these things called seasonal calendars. Whilst looking just like a bunch of words and pictures, these are an incredible amount of information here about how the world works. And in many ways, much more nuanced than the Gregorian calendar that we pay attention to today, thinking that, it's the first of whatever month, therefore X must be happening. These are phenomenological seasonal calendars that we understand where we are in the rhythm of the world around us by what's happening. And that is a much more nuanced and, I think, sensible way to exist, particularly where global rates of change are accelerating. And the things around us are both visible and invisible, are detecting these things well before we can. So thinking about crickets in particular, here's a particular seasonal calendar from the northwest of Australia. And quite fascinatingly, I don't know if you guys can see this, is that in this particular community in the Kimberley, we call it in northwestern Australia, there are 3 particular crickets that signify very, very particular things. There's a cricket that signifies when particular resources are available. There's another cricket that arrives shortly after that is used to catch little fish, which are then used to catch big fish. And then subsequently, there's another cricket arrives that is then cooked and used for food. These are very important to components of the seasonal cycle and the indicators that these people are living in. Taking it even deeper, there's further across the top of Australia, crickets, the Leichhardt grasshopper, for example, is associated with the first storms and when the particular trees are flowering and when the incredibly important resource of crocodile and turtle eggs become available. People know when they can start harvesting these things when the crickets appear, not based on any other abstract understanding of time. And this is all dependent on the response of crickets and the presence of crickets in the landscape and in their environment. And if these things went missing, you would miss a very critical cue to understand what to do and when to do it. This is woven into mythology with the Northern Australian communities, also in the north west. It's the crickets arriving, or the cricket sound of a particular cricket arriving or grasshopper arriving signifies when the seasons are changing. And this community believe that this grasshopper is the child of the lightning man because it arrives just prior to a series of intense dry lightning strikes that occur just before the monsoon sets into tropical North Australia. And people know what's happening because the cricket has arrived and has signalled that to them. And so important that it's woven into their creation stories, their mythology. If we move across to Kakadu, we see this particular type of cricket. It's a little green cricket in the top left there. You can see a little sign there. But basically when this cricket starts its mating calls, a very important type of potato, if you like, a yam, becomes available to harvest. Now, these things are under the ground. You don't know when to expend the energy into digging them up, but when this cricket starts mating, you know that the yams are ready. These are very important cues that are present, that we take for granted, these sounds that create the fabric of our existence. Not just in Australia that you see these deep relationships all over the world. The Hopi in Southwest North America, it's a sign of good luck. Crickets are a sign of good luck and abundance for these communities. Deep interwoven in notions of fertility as grasshoppers or crickets to the Aztecs of Central America. And still to this very day, the descendants of the Aztecs regularly consume crickets, along with some tasty beverages by the looks of it. So these things are still fundamentally important, both as an economic and a resource value, but also as a seasonal indicator and a mythological entity. Take it across to Japan and you see the same kinds of things. In Japan, people keep crickets as pets. They are associated as a food item. They are deified in some parts of Japan. They are a very important component of their landscape. And what this does, this cultural connection, gives us a reason, if you like, and either a conscious or a subconscious reason to care for these things, to understand that that they're missing, to understand why they're missing, and to rectify that problem, because it has a series of other flow-on effects that are critical, pivotal for life. And this kind of braided understanding that traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous communities have between the world around them, their place in the world, the spirituality, the economic, the pragmatic, all of these things are interwoven. And that's one, I think, very critical component that's been lost. And there are echoes of it in the previous talks that I've just heard. There's been some really key examples there that say, Ross mentioned about the sound being so important. But when we focus just on the species, when we just focus on the habitat, I think we fail to connect, and we fail to undo the central reason why we've let these things disappear in the first place. We didn't care enough to notice that they were gone, or to stop their disappearance in the first place, if we don't start connecting on a meaningful level. And we know, for example, in Indigenous communities, if we're thinking about environmental health, we know that the more autonomy that Indigenous people, or control that Indigenous people have over their lands, if you follow that green graph there, they are positive environmental outcomes. The ladder on the left-hand side is a hierarchy of the amount of involvement that Indigenous people have in the control of their lands, from excluded right through to completely autonomous. And you can see that once this kind of philosophy kicks in, this philosophy of connectedness, this philosophy of understanding the role that organisms like this have, you get better environmental outcomes, the connectedness of different organisms. And this is not just for, idiosyncratic to Indigenous peoples. I mean, there are crickets and locusts and all these kinds of things woven through art, culture, literature of both the Western Indigenous and Eastern philosophies and cultures and practices all across the world. They are such a ubiquitous organism that they are represented in almost every part of the world. And another thing that Ross touched on, and I'd like to just take a little deeper, and there are people who have thought about this more deeply than I, that we have started to recognise the critical importance of sound, or the biophony, or the sounds that nature makes. And I don't think there's a more recognisable sound or organism that makes a more recognisable sound than the cricket. Maybe the cicadas here. We have a particular time of year in Melbourne where the cicadas are almost deafening, and it's amazing, but also frustrating at times. But this sound is critically important, and it rhythms through the world into this sort of bioacoustics. And there's a whole realm of thought around acoustic ecology, not only in creating healthy landscapes, but also for making us healthy and allowing us to connect and find our place in the world around us. So projects like this, I think, are incredibly fascinating feats of human ingenuity, incredibly fascinating projects and experiments in translocation and how we can reintroduce species. The critical piece for me, and the perspective I bring, is that we need to understand and connect on the long term and in a meaningful way to these kinds of efforts and these kinds of organisms, if they are the successful translocation is going to work and these things remain for future generations. So I think I've caught us up a bit back on time, Alex. So that's it for me.
Thanks so much, Michael. Yeah, I think we've caught up on time. Thanks for reminding us about the oversized role of the cricket in the environment, and how it might be helpful for us to look at the role of care and connecting, especially within a phenomenological calendar rather than a more sort of bureaucratic Western calendar. So hopefully these first few lightning talks have set the scene for the project Song of the Cricket at the Architettura Biennale, which we will now turn to for a more detailed analysis. Our next speaker is Filippo Buzzetti, who is an entomologist, and he graduated in natural sciences and he earned a PhD at the University of Padova. He's a teacher of mathematics and science. He was a teacher of mathematics and science in middle schools, and he collaborates as an entomologist with the Fondazione Museo Civico di Rovereto, and he's a member of the IUCN Grasshopper Specialist Group. He curated the Italian species for the European Red List of grasshoppers, crickets, and bush crickets. His research fields are the bioacoustics and systematics of the Architettura and the Neotropics, Southeast Asia and Africa. He has authored and co-authored many scientific papers and books. His presentation will focus on the Architettura conservation. Thank you, Filippo.
Thank you, Natalie, for having me. I will talk today about this cricket, Zeuneriana marmorata, but I would like to leave the place for just a few seconds to this cricket. Can you play the sound, please? Okay. Thank you very much. So what you hear here is the soundscape, indeed, of the habitat of Zeuneriana marmorata. But this cricket is the main character of our talk, is the species why we are here today. And we are facing a very multi-factor history, because this cricket was thought to be extinct because of human activities, especially drainage of habitats, of fields, and because of anti-mosquitoes treatments that were massively done during the first half of the last century. And this cricket is, it was living all along the coast of North Adriatic Sea and in the wet areas. It was so common that was also drawn in the local churches as a component of the cultural landscape of the region. But after these human activities, the species was almost extinct until the 1996, when remaining population was discovered. This instigated further researches, and these field researches resulted in the finding of new subpopulations. So this made us think about the possibility to translocate, so to take some individuals from one locality to another. We chose this locality to take some individuals and move them to a protected area near the city of Monfalcone. This area was known for having the suitable habitat, but lacking the species Zeuneriana marmorata. So we moved some individuals and we checked the situation in the following years. The first translocation was done in the 2021. So we found the presence of the cricket also in the 2022, in the 2023, and in the last year, 2024. We still have to check this year. But what we can say until now is that the population is increasing in the area of occupancy, and the area of this local population is spreading, is widening. So this gives us a hope for the project that we are planning for the reintroduction in the Venice Lagoon. Here you see the past checking of the population in the translocation locality, and this success made also the newspapers, the local newspapers, publishing papers about the success of this project, and instigated also further researches in other areas, so that we found a new population also in another protected area, in the Parco del Mincio, where this is a very interesting place because it is far from the coast. It is, if you look on the figure on the right, you see the red dots that are very far from the coast, from the area where this species was formerly known. So Axel called me last autumn, and we started this new project. We started thinking about translocating the species from the Parco del Mincio to the Venice Lagoon, because we have to keep in mind that the Venice Lagoon was one of the core areas of the presence of the historic presence of the cricket in the northeast Italy. So we involved other institutions and partners for this project, and we chose especially the Parco del Mincio because it is this new locality, and it is a very abundant population with many individuals, and is a protected area. And we chose as translocation locality the Oasi Valle Averto because it is a protected area. It lacks the cricket species that we are focusing, and so we planned a long-term project with many factors considered, and this is what you see if you come to visit us in the Venice Biennale. We have living individuals in cages that are active and are singing right now, and there are also the floating islands, but Alex will talk later about it. So what we would like to do is translocate some eggs of this species to some areas of the Venice Lagoon. This because we would like to test another technique of translocation, not with living individuals, but with eggs, because in the cages that are now in the Venice Biennale, there are both male and females. These individuals are adult, and are mating. So hopefully the females will lay eggs in the substrate of the cages, and we will transfer the substrate to the floating islands. These floating islands will be moved in some areas in the Valle Averto area, oasis, and in the oasis of Mille Campi in the Venice Lagoon. So thank you very much for having me. I leave now the word to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo. I think you've really shared what a complex network of collaborators have come on board for this project, and also the role of hope in translocating the Adriatic marbled bush cricket. Our next speaker, we will return to Alex Felsen, who will give some insights into how he led and shaped and developed Song of the Cricket for the Venice Biennale. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Natalie and Filippo. It's great to be online with you presenting. We spent a lot of time together in Venice, and it was really the connection. I think the collaborative relationship that was built with Ari and Michael here, and has been developing also with Natalie, and you'll meet others, Miri, the fine arts composer, and Michael Sean Fletcher and others. And then being able to reach out to to Filippo and to others in Italy, and to establish this working relationship, and then build on that, I think was really a pleasure and life-changing in a lot of ways, in terms of realizing what one can do as a landscape architect when you develop a robust model of collaboration, and how that can actually transfer to new locations. So I'm going to talk now about the special project. I think that it was really exciting to be able to submit and this proposal to the Venice Biennale. We had the opportunity, we were invited to submit the proposal. There were a whole series of probably maybe 5 rounds of reevaluation before we were accepted. Eventually, because of the alignment of the project to the curator's vision for the Biennale, our project was selected as a special project that embodied the interdisciplinary collaboration and embedded the scientific research to produce these kind of scientific insights. So it really aligned with the curator's vision for the Biennale. And it's interesting that a landscape architecture-led team was able to facilitate and create a project like this in an architecture context. There's a lot of that kind of dynamic going on within landscape architecture and other associated disciplines, where we're in some ways facing some territorial definition and some kind of diluting of some of the role that I think our profession plays in bridging across disciplines. And I think it's really important, in my mind, to have been able to bring together this team effectively, and to kind of organize the group within, as you can see, the University of Melbourne, so across multiple disciplines, which ultimately, in my opinion, is where landscape architecture should and could fit within the academic institution, bridging across these disciplines and working in a collaborative model. At the same time, building these relationships with researchers in Italy, and with Filippo, who you've met now, who has this long commitment to the cricket and to rehabilitation, but also opening up the relationship between bioscience researchers such as Ari Hoffman and the entomologists in Italy, and thinking about different permitting requirements, different processes for translocation, and investigating those across across countries, and seeing, kind of comparing notes and learning from it. But at the same time, having Ross, Dennis, and the Arab team involved with that industry academic partnership was quite critical. And we brought in a number of different groups, manufacturers, including Biomatrix, which are leaders in floating islands. AFLEX Technology built the floating inner tube components. We worked with irrigation specialists, etc. And then within the lab, a number of critical participants, Gina Dahl and Harry Baxter and Vittorio Lobetta, and working in the lab to kind of pull this off. So we mentioned this kind of connection between Michael and Ari's research here, Filippo's research there. In a way, translocation became kind of the bridge between Australia and Italy. And that agenda for landscape architects thinking about how to construct viable ecological communities for the future, I think, should embrace the potential opportunity of translocation as a tool, a carefully managed tool, and a tool that one has to think about and understand the underlying ethics and the responsibility that it places on us as designers to be able to work with organisms, living organisms, as kind of a design medium, or as a as an architect say, more than human species. So trying to figure out how, or trying to work out the process of how to do this in an effective way and how we might incorporate this into our discipline is something that I think is quite critical. I mentioned the matchstick grasshoppers and the coarse grain versus the fine grain plots. One of the ideas, we kind of translated that notion of the plot that we were constructing as a what we call a experimental aesthetic. So in a way, that coarse grain plot, I didn't talk very much about this, but we were working with the city of Melbourne for the matchstick grasshopper. And we actually navigated through the maintenance team in Royal Park because the design team kind of was already collaborating with urban horticulture. And so in working with the maintenance team, we didn't want to make it too obviously aesthetic because it had to kind of come across as a restoration ecology project. But in working with the researchers, with Ari and Michael, we ended up giving it a pretty interesting aesthetic because of the experimental design drivers. So it's interesting how you kind of shift responsibility and prioritization and that the experimentation of the project can actually inform the geometry and the aesthetics of the project. And I think one of the values of this, the plot that we developed, is it's kind of a medallion. It's like a marker that endangered species are here. And I think that idea of starting to develop medallions, like we've now translated into the raft, as an indicator of important ecological species health and viability, I think is something that is needed in our society because of this disconnect or decoupling of ecological knowledge. Going back to Michael Sean Fletcher's really fantastic discussion around the role of different seasonal stages of the cricket and how that relates to food access and to other important criteria. So this was actually the first diagram that we sent in for the project. And basically, I think this is a great example of landscape architecture thinking. Hopefully you'll agree, where you're thinking about the entire lagoon, recognizing the loss of the species, recognizing the importance of individuals and their role in discovering, rediscovering, and translocating that species, and then thinking about how the Biennale itself can serve as a art and science space for reintroducing the cricket, exploring the locations where the cricket might live, thinking about how to display the cricket, embedding field research as part of that process, celebrating the sound as an indicator of ecosystem health, building up an understanding of the potential for reintroducing the cricket and translocation sites, and then how that might actually be reintroduced to the lagoon as a longer-term rehabilitation. So in a sense, the Biennale serves as a means to an end. We really have a longer-term goal in place here, and the Biennale serves as a venue for a stopover, essentially, for the cricket. And the reason we sort of selected the cricket in the first place was its life cycle actually happens to align with the Biennale. So when it's growing into early stage adult, as it's just coming through its nymph stage, that's right when the Biennale was starting. So we wanted to actually collect just before the Biennale, and we brought the crickets in, and they matured in the Biennale to the point where they're now singing, and soon they'll be breeding, we hope. And that process of, they'll basically die of old age, and the eggs that they have produced are the next generation. And that next generation then will be brought into or transferred to the mobile habitats, and then translocated to the sites that we've selected. And so basically the life cycle of the organism is on display and celebrated as part of the exhibition at the Biennale. It puts landscape architecture in the foreground. It introduces an international project that bridges across countries. It celebrates the design experiments component, and provides an opportunity for a variety of research opportunities. And the sound garden and the importance of sort of science on display is played out. And you can see that we then thought about this process of design and construction, the Venice Biennale, the translocation at the end of the Biennale, and then the longer term lagoon rehabilitation as the project. I just did this diagram today to try to sort of like celebrate and recognize the landscape architect's role in all of this. As a landscape architect, I am obviously somewhat biased, but I do think that our profession is well placed to foster these critical communication channels with a vision for how to implement and build and maintain, which is quite critical. And I wasn't able to get the maintenance components into this diagram, but it should be somewhere right after or around project contextualization. But the maintenance side of this is as important as the design and the negotiation. And so in a way, what we did is we built this working relationship with biosciences. And we also were working with the city of Melbourne. I mentioned that, in a sense, the urban horticulture, urban ecology groups in Melbourne, which are quite excellent, already have a working relationship with the city. And in some ways, the landscape architect, I felt, needed to find some other channels into working with the city. And I ultimately like to work closely with bioscience researchers who are more specialized in particular organisms, because I think it's an opportunity for the landscape architect to bridge with more raw ecological knowledge, where the urban ecologist tends to be a kind of a generalist on the ecological side, similar to our profession. And so, there's a question of sort of territory and definition, which I think is fundamentally important for the future of our field. But aligning with someone like R.A. Hoffman, an ecologist and a geneticist, there's a robust space to debate and discuss the kind of critical landscape scale decisions, and we haven't even gotten deeply into the genetic variability that Ari was mentioning, but that's a whole other channel of discussion to consider. So we worked with this matchstick grasshopper, and in a sense, we found a cricket in Venice that allowed us to take this relationship to Venice. And that the cricket, the selection of that cricket, it allowed us to kind of, as a series of disciplines, to build around it essentially, and to kind of develop this project as a as an architecture, landscape architecture design project as part of the Biennale. And the connection with Arup, I think, is quite critical. As landscape architects, I think we all know that bridge between academic and industry relationships is fundamental, and that there are critical discoveries and inventions that can happen by working across those professions. So having Arup's team involved in multiple ways, and you can see that they actually connected directly with fine arts, and Miri will mention that shortly, as well as with the engineering team doing geospatial planning. That connection across, and the cross-grained, cross-disciplinary nature of Arup, I think, lends itself to this kind of collaborative model. And then, we went into project construction. So this is as I was on site in Venice, taking the boat, collecting the plants, doing the planting, doing all these different stages of construction, I was thinking to myself, it's really important and valuable that there's a landscape architecture team here, working not only on the conceptualization of the project, but also on the implementation and the day-to-day, and then thinking about that project contextualization. So recognizing that the Biennale is a component, but really the translocation site where we're taking it to this Valle Aberto, which Filippo mentioned, is so critical, because that is essentially the project. We're collecting a cricket from a particular subpopulation. We're managing it in the Biennale, and then we're translocating it to a site in the Venice Lagoon. This hasn't been done in over a century, or that the cricket hasn't been in the lagoon in over a century, probably, or roughly. And this role of bringing the cricket back and translocating is a model that could occur in multiple locations in the future. So the idea that that valet might be the first of multiple locations in the Venice Lagoon is something that's exciting. And I think in a way, one thing I would mention is that, having the bioscience researchers here, and we've had a conversation a couple of weeks ago about this, the implementation side of the project maybe wasn't the primary opportunity for their role. But as we started to look at the location we were translocating to, the opportunity of thinking about the larger scale translocation project in the future is an area where the bioscience researchers come back in and have great expertise. And so it's partly a question, I think, for the landscape architect about recognizing the importance of collaboration and figuring out where individuals can contribute over time. Filippo showed this point. The project, the Biennale, couldn't have happened without the translocation project, because that really was the testing to indicate that there's an opportunity to relocate and to allow the species to expand. We have this idea of introducing the cricket into public space because we want to sort of recognize the sound and think about the sound as an indicator of ecosystem health in the future. Maybe that population that's in the wetlands, that's the sound of that population, could be broadcast in a public space. And so people entering that public space would have an awareness of how the Venice Lagoon health is faring over time. It's something that we're thinking about as an idea, but then, over time, the notion is that we would then translocate the species. And Filippo has talked a bit about this translocation agenda, taking it from a particular subpopulation, bringing it to Venice, and then reintroducing it to a location within the lagoon, not too far from where we were, about 40 minutes. It turned out that this site that we are reintroducing it to is a perfect destination. We have a video that goes over the site and has an interview with the manager of the site. It's a WWF biodiversity managed site. It's several centuries old. It's a sustainable fisheries where they built an embankment along the edge and then created a whole series of sluices and channels that they used to flow fish through to kind of basically fatten them up and then collect them when they reach a certain size. It's just a perfect site for reintroducing the cricket because it's well managed, and it's managed for that Phragmites that Ross was talking about that exists in the intertidal zone. And we had this wonderful conversation with the manager where we just realized that there was no additional maintenance required. The cricket could fit right into the ecological community that he'd been cultivating for 10 years. And the exciting thing is that the valet, or this fisheries, exists. There's multiple valets across the Venice Lagoon. So there's maybe 16 or 20 of these conditions across the lagoon. So when we were talking with the bioscience researchers, the idea of using this translocation as a template and then reintroducing the cricket to multiple valets in the long-term future provides an opportunity for a large-scale designed experiment well beyond the original one that we've been thinking about. So this whole mapping exercise, which Maz will talk about shortly in terms of the coding and analysis, allowed us to investigate and consider these locations and really to identify some of these sites where the crickets could be introduced. This is the life cycle of the cricket. And part of what we're saying is that we're essentially recognizing the seasonality of the cricket and gathering the eggs and reintroducing those eggs across the lagoon. So there's a spatial temporal aspect to the project, which is quite important. So, just going through and saying that, as a landscape architect, there was a lot of work behind the scenes in this project to set up the components of it. And this was one day when Filippo and I worked together to fill the wetland systems. We had to be quite creative about what we put into it. And it was all these different stages of the project where essentially, I was proud and thankful that I had this background experience and knowledge as a landscape architect to be able to collect Phragmites in the lagoon. So we put Phragmites from the lagoon that was more acclimated to the salinity of the lagoon into the wetlands, along with some nursery grown Phragmites in the higher portions of the wetlands so that we could have a kind of combination. We had to set it all up, and we put in irrigation into the system. So we're able to put some fresh water in because we were a bit concerned about the health of the plants over time. Filippo, when he collected the crickets, gave me 12, which I then took around Venice and photographed throughout Venice. It was just exciting to think about this population of crickets that we're reintroducing for the first time, you know, and sort of the importance of this particular gene pool and subpopulation as a catalyst for the populations over time. And because this goes back to Ari's point that, you know, understanding the genetics of the genetic variability and thinking about what are the best approaches to reintroduce and to develop this translocation over time in a way that produces robust gene pools, I think is a good question that needs to be explored further. Ross talked about the intertidal zone. The amazing thing about the site that we had is that it essentially crossed that intertidal zone. So we had a land side and a water side, and you know, you could essentially reconstruct this as the intertidal zone. So it was an amazing education opportunity for the public to start to understand what is the intertidal zone, how it work for these particular crickets, because the crickets themselves, when they lay their eggs, the eggs do best when they get inundated with water. So the crickets essentially have to find that sort of sweet spot across the intertidal zone where their eggs will get inundated for a period of time in order for the crickets to hatch. And you can just see, so this kind of, we were just very fortunate to be offered this location, you know, from a ecological standpoint, but also you'll see from a music and the composition standpoint as well. And yeah, and the crickets, the idea that we had about this idea of, or the notion of the song as a bioindicator, you know, thinking about the cricket and its instrument and how it plays its instrument seasonally at certain times, and recognizing that that sound can be recorded, can be digitally evaluated. Sorry about that. And, you know, can be used in a digital twin technology, which is one of the things we're working on with the CSDILA, which Maz will talk about a little bit, is how this data and information can be fed into a longer term management strategy for the for biodiversity ecosystem health. You know, the notion is that essentially if we are able to reintroduce this population of crickets or a population of crickets into multiple ballets or fisheries, former fisheries around the lagoon, and because they inhabit that zone between 130 to 3 meter space that Ross was talking about, that basically the cricket itself could become an indicator or a sentinel of ecosystem health in relation to the behavioral management practices around the flood defense system. So these were some placards that we had put onto the enclosures, just thinking about the crickets as endangered species, as food web catalysts, as these climate change sentinels, recognize their song as bioindicators, thinking about the cricket and their habitat and the crickets and culture. So I'm just going to start to wrap up by just showing a few more images of the site and its location. So these are the mobile habitats that will basically be taking the debris and the eggs and depositing them on these. We have a netting that we'll put on top, and then we can actually pull these with a boat to the translocation sites, or we could keep them netted and allow the crickets to go through another life cycle if we think that's a benefit for the species. So there's opportunities to sort of be flexible about how we manage the crickets over time. And this is the site that we were working on, and you can see the 3 mobile habitats here and the cricket enclosures here. And we have the signs over here. So in a sense, our exhibit is sort of in this zone here. I just wanted to mention that the sound space, and I don't want to take away from Amiri's presentation, but I just want to applaud, I guess, and also emphasize the critical importance of the sound as a design component in this project. The sound itself embodied a much larger area than the landscape design. And what it did is it really expanded that the identity of the project, and it captured sort of space in a way that was kind of left over there was a magical moment when Miri came and we got the music going for the first time, where it just everything changed. There was like a peace, and people came and sat, and people voting stopped, and it was just like this really incredible influence on the space. It was quite special. So yeah, it was a great experience to set this project up as a landscape architect, to think through the construction of enclosures that would allow the cricket to survive. There are challenges with this. One of the biggest ones I would say is the heat currently, and making sure that there's enough shade for the crickets to survive in the kind of temperatures and conditions that we're dealing with. But then also to think about how to give space for the public to explore. It's kind of hard to find the crickets in the space when you're there, but you hopefully can hear them now that they're starting to sing. And then, we have this the posters and the information about our project on the wall here, and the global cricket song, which I believe Miri will talk about as well as part of the design. So I am going to wrap up there and pass it to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Alex, you've certainly highlighted the role of the landscape architect as bridging between disciplines and having this really pivotal bringing together and coalescing of various disciplines, researchers and communities. Our next speaker is Maz Kabani, who will be speaking on geospatial planning and training of our model. Maz, if you could kindly introduce yourself, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah. Thank you, Natalie, for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Maz Qasemi, and I'm a data engineer with CSDLA. Had the chance to work with Alex and our team to do some spatial and geospatial analysis. Today, I'll be walking you through our geospatial study focused on mapping landscape change and identifying the future of habitat possibilities. Our primary goal was to support critical conservation efforts, specifically habitat restoration and species translocation planning. The work I'm presenting today established the analytical foundation for the current project, and just as importantly, it paves the way for a future adaptive digital twin that will allow for long-term environmental monitoring. To begin, our first objective was to tell the story of this landscape. How has it evolved over the decades? To answer this, we compiled a series of historical change maps and some visuals provided in the further of the story map, and we will show them. To answer this, we combined a series of historical change maps. These visuals are designed to communicate the dramatic shifts in the land cover, the spread and retreat of the key vegetation like Phragmites australis, and the changing footprint of potential cricket habitats. Looking beyond our immediate analysis, this foundational work sets the stage for a much larger and longer-term goal, an ecosystem management digital twin. Imagine a dynamic model that can simulate and adapt site selection for cricket translocation as environmental conditions like sea level rise or continues to evolve. While that is the future scope, our current efforts are the essential first steps. We are analyzing the past and present conditions, which is part A, and taking earlier steps in future modeling, which I'll touch on. So how did we accomplish this? Our technical approach relied on the power of Google Earth Engine and Python, specifically the GMAP library, to process and visualize vast amounts of multi-time temporal satellite data. This was supported by crucial topographic and sea level datasets. Our analysis is built on rich foundation of data. The key sources include satellite imagery. We use surface reflectance composites from Landsat 5, 7, and 8, giving us a consistent 30-meter resolution view of the landscape from 1985 to 2020. And we had the chance to gather some field data from different studies. At the same time, we had the elevation data such as SRTM digital elevation model. And in addition, we had some climate projections data. The workflow started by performing some image processing to ensure all satellite data was clean and comparable. Next, we ran an unsupervised. Alex, if you go to the first section, where we have the unsupervised classification.
Yep.
Yes. So we ran an unsupervised classification to get a broad overview of the land cover and its changes, and we then attempt a more detailed supervised classification, and Alex can show that later on. And this was followed by a change detection analysis between these periods as well. And we also calculated some several key vegetation indices, such as NDVI, NDPI, and SAVI, to measure plant health and moisture. Finally, we integrated the topographic and sea level data to add that crucial context of vulnerability. With that context on our methods, let's dive into the results. What is the landscape actually telling us? The first result was historical land cover maps from 1985 to 2020. Our first pass at understanding change came from unsupervised learning approach. We applied a key means clustering algorithm to our Landsat data for each decade. This algorithm grouped pixels based on purely on their spectral signatures into 5 broad categories. Urban. Alex, if you go to the up, you can show it. The first one, because I'm still talking about the unsupervised.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Go up.
There.
So we have 5 categories: urban, water, vegetation, agriculture, and wetland. Because we didn't use pre-labeled training data, these maps reveal the major unbiased shifts in the landscape. And what they show might not be 100% correct. You can see pre-built areas along the lagoon edge and contracting marsh zones as well. In the next step, we did the temporal change analysis. Building on that, we conducted a web application as well and showing the changes from 1985 to 1990 and do it every 10 years. So we saw a rapid urban growth from 1985 to 1990 and agriculture expansion, which came at the expenses of water bodies, vegetation, and wetlands. And finally, in our final period, from 2010 to 2020, the rate of change slowed overall through the decline in natural vegetation. Natural vegetation. In the next section, and to get a more nuanced view of ecosystem health, we calculate several vegetation indices. Each one tells a part of the story. For instance, the NDVI, or Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which measures plant greenness, shows a strong early increase of 17%, suggesting an expansion of reed beds. This was followed by a gradual decline, indicating habitat stress, but then uh, uh, pronounced rebound of 20% in the most recent period. It means 2010 to 2020, pointing to a vegetation recovery. The NDMI, or moisture index, tells a different story. It shows an early increase, suggesting a wetter condition, but this is followed by a pronounced 40% decline, reflecting progressive dying. This trend of moisture loss continues, underscoring ongoing stress on wetland ecosystem. The Savi, which adjusts for soil brightness, mirrors the NDVI trend: a strong initial rise, a gradual decline suggesting thinning vegetation, and then a pronounced rebound pointing to renewed reedbed. Finally, the NDPI, or Pigment Difference Index, shows a dramatic surge over of 200% in early period, followed by a steady growth and another recent rise. This confirms significant improvements in plant biomass. Next, we move to supervised classification, where we trained a random forest model to specifically identify Phragmites australia, or reedbed, in 2020 imagery. The model performed reasonably well, with an overall accuracy of about 85%. However, it struggled to capture all of the Phragmites stands, and its precision was moderate and its recall was low. What this tells us is that while the model is useful, its maps should be considered guiding rather than definitive. And our change detection masks, which directly compare pixels over the time, reveal clear pattern of reed colonization, expansion, and loss. These visual patterns echo and confirm the trends we saw in the vegetation indices over the decades. And this is all. Thank you for listening to me.
Thanks, Maz. That's great.
Thanks, Maz, Dak, for sharing your data mapping and analysis of the lagoon and wetlands and the ideas of plant health and moisture. Our final speaker today is Miriama Young, who is the composer of the astonishing soundscape that amplifies the song of the cricket. She is a composer and sound artist, originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Miriama is Associate Professor and Head of Composition at the Melbourne Conservatorium of Music. In her 25 years as a composer, her music has been performed from Norway to New Zealand and by ensembles including the Sydney Symphony, the Scottish Opera, and So Percussion. Her sound world is grounded in themes of place, memory, and ecology. Welcome, Miriama.
Thanks, Natalie, and thanks everybody who may or may not still be listening, I congratulate you on hanging in this long, frankly. And I'd also just like to thank Alex for bringing me into this project, and it's been absolute pleasure to be a part of it, and I think it's his generosity of spirit that's enabled all of us to become a part of this. It's become so interdisciplinary and so exciting. I'm going to speak pretty quickly just to get through a few points, play you a little bit of sound. The sound quality is not great, so I'm not going to play a whole bunch for you, but we will be putting some of the sound aspects online for you to enjoy at a later date. So you can see the personnel here. I'll speak to that a little later. If we move to the next slide, essentially we designed this as 3 sound zones. The first one is the lawn area, which you saw in some of the photos, and I'll show you in a minute as well. So the first one was the lawn area, which incorporated the sound garden, which was basically a kind of idealized wetland biophony. The second zone was situated in the shipyard. And I'll speak to that in a minute. And then there was a global cricket choir as well. We go to the next slide, please. If we could go to the next slide, thanks. So the sound garden was created basically as from sounds drawn from northern Italian wetland sounds. And I sort of cobbled these together to make a sort of fantastical environment, sort of to create a bioacoustically healthy wetland environment, and featuring the green toad, the Eurasian reed warbler, the Italian tree frog, various birds, and then there was sounds of water and so on. Okay, next slide, please. And then in the Gaggiandra, there was, which is basically a shipyard, this was sort of what I'm calling the second zone, which for a sound artist, frankly, is a very exciting space to fill. And Alex gave me a lot of freedom with how to work with this zone. Acoustically, the space acts something like a church. It has very long reverb times naturally, so it basically makes music sound really good, but detail does tend to get lost. So I figured out pretty quick that the music for this space needed to be slow, and we needed to fill the space with something that was quite ambient. We ended up placing a quad speaker array plus a subwoofer to get some nice good bass coverage in there. So the acoustics in there really invited for me a sense of bringing a place where meditation or ritual might operate. And I sort of chose to work with sounds that might suggest something of the sacred, and to sort of create a sort of meditative past, future, present kind of environment sonically. All right, if we just move to the next slide. Thanks. I've got a little snippet here of sort of how it all kind of fell together in terms of sound. You can hear in this excerpt the foreground, which is the wetland soundscape, mixed with the synthesized sounds in the background that are coming through from the shipyard area beyond. If you could just play the little video clip there for me, thanks. Okay, that was a very short clip, no worries. If we just move to the next slide now. So we worked, oh, it's back, not to worry. You'll hear some more in a minute. We worked closely with Arup in Melbourne, and with, if we could move to the next slide, please. Thanks. We worked with Arup, their sound lab, and specifically with their sound specialist, Sophie Gleason, to test the sound zones that we'd composed. And what Sound Lab can do is essentially simulate the 3D sonic space of a proposed acoustic environment in order to project how sounds will behave in that space. Go to the next slide. So using ambisonics, our computer modeled the Biennale shipyard, this sort of space that you can see there, as well as the lawn for us, so that we could sort of test how these two zones were going to interact with each other, and how what we'd compose would sound when we landed in Italy, which took a lot of the guesswork out of it, and we were basically able to set it up and it just worked, which was a real gift. Okay, next slide, please. The Gatiandra was, as I said, the shipyard area, which, yeah, was historically the place where they built ships. The Venetians apparently built a ship a day in this, on this site. Whether or not that's true, in any case, it was a hive of industry at one point. This Gatiandra area resonates with Venice's rich cultural past as well. And for anyone who's been to Venice, you get the sense that Vivaldi is sort of everywhere, and it is perhaps a little bit of a cliche there. But the interesting thing about Vivaldi is that when he was composing in Venice, where he lived, they think that the sound of nature would have been all around him, and the crickets would have been very active. And I was really drawn to this idea of somehow bringing Vivaldi back to this place, but perhaps in a different context. I drew directly from Vivaldi's Four Seasons, which is obviously a pretty famous piece of his, from his summer excerpt movement, composed in 1723. And I would posit that actually you can hear the sound of the crickets in that piece. He actually annotates in the score some of the other sounds in there. I realize I'm running out of time, so I'm going to quickly flick through. So we've got this the next slide, if we just move to that. Yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Now, if we just move forward, yeah, we also had an app which was on the iPad, which was playing a global cricket choir. This was built with sound technologist Monica Lim and Ben Lang from Computer and Information Systems at University of Melbourne. And basically people could zoom in and pick their cricket from anywhere in the world, including, it could be the cricket where they came from, and play that and have it playing into the shipyard space along with this very, very slowed down Vivaldi score. All right, I'm going to basically wrap up. If we just go to the last slide now, we'll just zoom ahead. I just wanted to sort of close by saying that for me, that, you know, Venice is really the city that provokes this nostalgia. And so I guess for me, I wanted to create a sonic space where the audience would be able to reflect on our ecological past, and also perhaps imagine a more hopeful future, one in which ecosystems might once again thrive. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Miri, for sharing the bioacoustics of Song of the Cricket and amplifying their song with your beautiful soundscape. And the Venice Biennale is on until the 23rd of November, and we hope that you might have an opportunity to visit. I think we have about 2 minutes left before we close. We'd certainly like to thank all of you for joining us online. We're thrilled to share our project Song of the Cricket from the Architettura Biennale. We are supported by the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects, and we thank them. And hopefully we've explored and shared with you how this cross-disciplinary project has many voices, and together we have formed a collective symphony. And we hope you might be able to visit our project in Venice. Are there any comments or questions? Alex, perhaps you'd like to have the final word of what happens now to Song of the Cricket. Where are they? Are they mating? Are they getting ready to translocate?
Thanks so much, Natalie. Yeah, I think it's been great to sort of see the range across the collaborative team here, and to envision, hopefully, for those landscape architects on the call, to think about your own projects and to think about how to enhance this kind of collaborative model effectively to move forward on climate resilience and adaptation, and culturally informed sort of choices around design, and I guess in my mind, I think that the having each of you speak from your own perspective and having your own voices shared is critical, because I think that is the way that collaboration can work. I don't think it's necessarily about the designer synthesizing everything into their own voice. I think it's important for designers to create space and opportunity for this collective debate and discussion and approach. And personally, I think that's one of the things that landscape architects bring forward. I think we're a fairly humble profession. I think we recognize the strength of the materials that we work with and the power of working with living organisms. And yeah, I think it's been a good opportunity to share the exciting aspects of this project. So even in considering where the crickets are, how they're doing now, I would defer to Filippo. He's in Italy and he's knowledgeable about this particular organism. And we had many discussions about how to construct the cages effectively for their health. And I remain concerned about ensuring that, they make it through the heat of Italy currently, and that we have a population that's able to breed, and, that we are able to secure a positive outcome in terms of translocating this population to a site in Venice. And hopefully that population will last, and I think we need to circle back around to Ari and other geneticists around how to then manage a population like this over time. Filippo, do you have any comments about the cricket that you wanted to share?
Well, no, you are right. I completely agree on the planning. And what I found very intriguing in this project is the cooperation between many partners of different backgrounds. This gave me a very wide view of what is the role of an insect in our life, not only in science or in ecology, but in art, in music, in architecture. This I found very, I hope people will gain awareness of this, because if we understand that nature touch us in many parts of our life, maybe we will take more care of the nature. It would be nice if we understand that we are the nature. Thank you.
Absolutely. And back to you, Natalie.
Thank you.
Final wrap up.
And thank you everyone online for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. I think, Filippo, you've left us with the idea of the role of the insect and taking care, which has threaded through many of the presentations today. So thank you and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.